In every age, humanity has told itself the same story. We are in control. We build the cities, we write the laws, we decide the future. And then, something too small to see walks in through the door. A cough, a rash, a fever that doesn't break. Empires stall, armies retreat, religions fracture, not because of a war or a revolution, but because of something we can't bargain with. Tonight, we're going to trace 5 plagues that didn't just kill people, they redesigned the world we live in. You're watching Shadow Chapters, where the darkest stories of our past are whispered back to life, one truth at a time. Settle in, turn the lights down, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because the next story might change how you see history itself. Our first plague arrived like a rumor. It came on ships, on rats, in the quiet spaces between heartbeat and breath. They called it the Black Death. In the mid-14th century, a bacterium we now call Yersinia pestis rode along trade routes from Central Asia, crept into the crowded ports of the Mediterranean, and then exploded across Europe. People didn't have a name for it at first. They had images: a swelling under the arm, a dark bruise on the skin that shouldn't be there, a neighbor who was alive in the morning and gone by night. In some towns, 1 in every 2 people vanished in just a few seasons. Entire family lines ended in a single winter. Fields lay empty. Churches filled with the sound of prayers that didn't seem to change anything. Imagine a street you know. Now imagine every second door standing open. The house behind it quiet. The fire cold. The bed unmade, because no one is left to sleep in it. The Black Death was not a single wave. It came in pulses, returning again and again, like a tide that refused to recede. People began to live with a kind of permanent flinch, always wondering if the cough they heard in the market might be the start of another season of dying. But the Black Death did more than kill. It broke the old order. With so many peasants dead, landowners suddenly found themselves with fields that no one could work. Labor became rare and valuable. Survivors started asking questions they had never dared ask. Why am I tied to this land? Why am I paid so little for work that now matters so much? Slowly, the feudal system, that rigid ladder of lords at the top and peasants at the bottom, began to crack. In some regions, wages rose. In others, laws were passed specifically to stop workers from demanding more pay. Those laws were a sign of fear from those at the top that the world they controlled was slipping away. The Black Death also reshaped faith. Some people turned toward religion with desperate intensity, joining processions, beating their own backs, begging for mercy. Others looked at the endless rows of bodies and quietly wondered, if this is the world as it is, maybe we've been wrong about how it works. Trust in old authorities, kings, priests, scholars, was shaken. In that shaken world, another change slowly began. Cities started to experiment with early forms of public health, quarantines, isolation, rules about ships and travelers. The very idea that a city could manage disease instead of just praying it away took root. Art became obsessed with death. Skeletons dancing with kings, queens, and beggars, all held equal in bony hands. Hourglasses and skulls stared from paintings as if to whisper, "Remember, none of this is permanent." The Black Death didn't just haunt Europe, it pulled it into a new era, with different wages, different beliefs, and a different relationship to the idea of death itself. Behind the statistics and dates, it is worth remembering this. The modern world began, in part, because so many people had to decide what to do after the worst had already happened. Our second plague struck nearly 1,000 years earlier in a world of marble columns, imperial banners, and whispered plans of glory. It was the 6th century, and the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, still dreamed of greatness. The Justinian Plague. Emperor Justinian wanted to reunite the old Roman world. He sent armies to reclaim lost provinces. He raised monuments. He saw himself as the man who would stitch the shattered empire back together. The capital, Constantinople, was the glowing heart of this dream. A city of gold mosaics, crowded markets, and narrow streets where languages from across 3 continents mingled in the air. And then, in 541, Ships carrying grain into the city brought something else in with them. Again, rats. Again, fleas. Again, a tiny enemy hitching a ride on human ambition. At first it looked like any other illness. A fever, a headache, a sense of heaviness. Then people started to notice something else. Swellings in the groin and under the arms, darkening skin, a smell of sickness that clung to entire neighborhoods. Numbers began to climb. In the heart of the empire, Constantinople, this city of glittering mosaics and crowded marketplaces, thousands of people began to die every single day. The city filled with the sound of cartwheels carrying bodies to mass graves. Priests whispered over hastily dug pits. Families who could afford it paid men to carry their dead away. Families who could not watch the bodies of their loved ones join anonymous piles. One historian of the time described streets so full of corpses that people struggled to walk without stepping on the dead. The plague of Justinian didn't just bring suffering, it brought exhaustion. An empire that had been projecting strength suddenly found itself fighting an enemy it couldn't see and couldn't outcommand. Tax revenues collapsed as farmers, traders, and artisans died or fled. Armies starved or disbanded. Buildings and fortifications remained unfinished, half dreams in stone. Far from the capital, enemies watched. Borders that had once been patrolled now stood thin and fragile. Territories that Justinian had reconquered slipped away again, not through glorious battles lost, but through weakness. Imagine an empire trying to hold a shield, while its hands are shaking from fever. The plague didn't come only once. It returned in waves over decades, battering the population again and again. Children who survived one outbreak grew up under the shadow of another. The empire learned painfully that this was not a single disaster to endure, but a rhythm to live with. Historians still debate the exact numbers, but many agree on this. Without the plague, the Eastern Roman Empire might have remained a dominant force in the Mediterranean for far longer. With it, the empire bled people, money, and strength. Just enough for new powers, new religions, and new borders to rise in the spaces it could no longer hold. A pathogen had quietly placed its hand on the map and moved lines that emperors thought were permanent. When we look back, we see Justinian's laws, his buildings, his wars. But running through all of it, like a dark thread, is the plague, a quiet co-author of history. Our third plague crossed an ocean. Smallpox, the invisible invasion. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought with them metal and horses, gunpowder and Bibles, and something else entirely. To them, it was barely worth noticing. Another sickness, another rash, a fever that came and went. To the indigenous peoples of the Americas, it was the beginning of the end of entire worlds. Smallpox did not need armies, it walked ahead of them. Imagine a village miles inland from the coast, far from the sound of European voices, far from the sight of their ships. One day, a trader arrives from another region, coughing. He feels tired but continues his journey. A few days later, spots appear on his skin. By the time anyone realizes something is wrong, he has already shared food, stories, and air with everyone he met. In many cases, the disease spread along trade routes and between settlements before Europeans even physically reached those regions. Stories tell of villages where almost no one survived. Bodies were left unburied because those who might have buried them were already sick themselves. Empires that had been stable for centuries, the Aztec, the Inca, and countless others whose names we do not speak enough, were suddenly hit by mortality rates that are almost impossible to comprehend. In the great city of Tenochtitlan, accounts describe a sickness that left people too weak to move, too covered in sores to be washed, too numerous to be properly mourned. Leaders died, their successors died soon after. The chain of command broke. In the Andes, as smallpox and other diseases moved through the Inca realm, they helped trigger civil wars and succession crises. When Spanish forces arrived, they were stepping into an empire already destabilized by invisible blows. Conquest often looks, on the surface, like superior weapons and strategy. Steel armor, firearms, unfamiliar tactics. But here, the most devastating weapon was something no one fully understood. European colonization of the Americas was made far easier by the fact that the societies they encountered were already shattered, politically, spiritually, demographically. by diseases like smallpox, measles, and others to which they had no previous exposure. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was a civilizational reset. Entire cultural traditions, stories, languages, and ways of seeing the world were cut short. Some survived in fragments, carried in memory, song, and resistance. Many did not. For survivors, the world they inherited was emptier and more dangerous. Old alliances had fractured, old rivalries had been made meaningless by the sheer scale of loss. Smallpox didn't come with a flag, but it might have been the most effective conqueror the world has ever seen. When we talk about the discovery of the New World, we rarely pause to consider this. For millions of people, the New World was already ancient, already full of history and meaning. What arrived with Europeans was not just conquest. It was a wave of disease that tore holes in the fabric of those worlds so large that colonization could flow through them. Our fourth plague came at a moment when the world was already bleeding. The 1918 Spanish flu, the pandemic before we had a name. It was 1918. The First World War had turned farmland into trenches and young men into statistics. In crowded barracks, field hospitals, and troop ships, a new strain of influenza began to move. Soldiers coughed in trenches. Nurses wiped sweat from feverish foreheads in makeshift wards. Trains carried the sick and the healthy together, city to city, continent to continent. The pandemic that followed would infect hundreds of millions worldwide. Unlike many flu outbreaks, this one seemed to have a cruel preference for the young and strong, people in the prime of their lives who could be perfectly healthy one week and lying in a mass grave the next. Bodies sometimes turned a frightening shade of blue as their lungs filled. Reports described people dying within hours of showing their first symptoms. In some towns, life seemed to collapse almost overnight. Schools closed, theaters went dark. Church services were canceled or moved outdoors, with people standing at careful distances praying into cold air. And yet, in many places, there was silence. Governments censored newspapers during the war. They didn't want to damage morale or admit to vulnerability. Spanish flu is a misleading name. It stuck largely because Spain, being neutral and less censored, reported the outbreak more openly. The virus didn't care about front lines or peace treaties. It traveled on breath and touch, on shared air, on human connection itself. There were waves, initial outbreaks, then lulls that gave people hope, then even deadlier surges. Just when communities thought the worst was over, a new variant seemed to arrive with greater speed and ferocity. Doctors did what they could with the tools they had: masks, isolation, fresh air, basic nursing. There were no antivirals, no vaccines ready in time, no ventilators. Imagine being a young parent in 1918, watching your child cough in a bed you cannot leave, while outside, a society already tired from war tries to pretend that everything is under control. When the pandemic finally slowed, the world had lost an estimated tens of millions of people, more than the war that had just ended. But the 1918 flu did something else. It reminded humanity that even in an age of machines and industry, we were still vulnerable to something microscopic. Governments and scientists began to rethink public health. They improved systems for tracking disease. They invested in laboratories. They started to treat epidemics as matters of national and international security. New institutions and approaches grew out of this experience. The idea that governments should coordinate during health crises, that transparency mattered, that public messaging could save or cost lives. The 1918 flu didn't just follow the war. In many ways, it rewrote the terms of peace. It planted a question in the back of humanity's mind. What if the next global crisis doesn't wear a uniform, but hides in a breath? Our fifth plague unfolded slowly. No mass graves on the evening news, no single date you can circle on a calendar and say, that's when it began. In the late 20th century, doctors in different parts of the world began noticing something strange. Young, otherwise healthy people developing rare infections and dying. What we now call HIV/AIDS emerged like a whisper, then a rumor, then a wave. At first, it was misunderstood, blamed on specific communities, wrapped in stigma, fear, and moral judgment. People weren't just fighting a virus. They were fighting shame. In some cities, entire neighborhoods felt the impact. Friends, lovers, siblings wasted away in hospital beds while governments debated whether this was a priority. Some leaders remained silent, Others spoke of it in cold, distant terms. Hospitals saw the same pattern over and over, collapsing immune systems, previously manageable infections suddenly becoming lethal, bodies weakening under the weight of illnesses that should not have been fatal. Families were often too afraid to speak openly. Obituaries used vague phrases. In some places, funerals became quiet acts of defiance, spaces where grief and anger finally had somewhere to go. In many parts of Africa, the virus moved through villages and cities at a terrifying pace, cutting through generations. Children were left without parents. Grandparents became primary caregivers. Whole communities carried invisible scars, measured not just in deaths, but in empty chairs at family gatherings. Yet the story of HIV/AIDS is also a story of resistance. Communities organized when institutions failed them. They formed support groups. They raised money for care. They marched and shouted and demanded research, treatment, honesty. Scientists, under pressure and driven by urgency, began to unravel how the virus worked, how it entered the body, how it hid, how it slowly dismantled the immune system from the inside. The science slowly caught up. Antiretroviral therapies transformed an almost certain death sentence into something people could live with, if they had access. Education and prevention campaigns began to change behavior. Mother-to-child transmission could be significantly reduced with proper treatment, but access was not equal. In wealthier countries, some people began to live long, relatively normal lives with HIV. In poorer regions, especially where healthcare systems were already stretched thin, millions continued to die for lack of medicines that existed, but were too expensive or too far away. HIV/AIDS has rewritten demographics, especially in parts of Africa. It has reshaped conversations about sexuality, about drug use, about human rights. It has forced societies to confront uncomfortable questions. Who is worth saving? Who gets treatment first? Whose suffering is easy to ignore? HIV/AIDS is not a single moment in history. It is a long, uneven wave that continues to shape lives today. In the shadows of this pandemic, new kinds of activism took form, new networks of care, new expectations that ordinary people could question and pressure systems that seemed unchangeable. A virus did that, but so did the people who refused to let that be the end of the story. 5 different plagues, 5 different centuries, continents, and contexts. But if you look closely, they share a quiet pattern. The Black Death cracked the old social order of Europe and forced people to rethink their place in the world. The Justinian Plague weakened an empire and quietly shifted the balance of power around the Mediterranean. Smallpox in the Americas cleared the path for conquest and colonization long before some battles were even fought. The 1918 flu taught governments that public health could topple nations just as surely as war. HIV/AIDS reshaped our ideas of stigma, activism, and who deserves to be saved. Each one didn't just kill, it edited human history. The world we live in, the languages we speak, the countries drawn on our maps. They are all, in part, the result of illnesses we couldn't see, understand, or control at the time. Behind every castle wall, every border, every city skyline, there is an invisible history of microbes, of plagues that opened some doors and slammed others shut. When we look back at history, it's easy to focus on kings and generals, revolutions and inventions. But somewhere beneath all of that, tiny things, invisible to the naked eye, are quietly deciding who gets to write the next chapter. In recent years, we have had our own reminders of this truth. We have watched charts and curves, listened to daily numbers, argued over masks and movement and responsibility. The details change. The pattern does not. Plagues reveal what was already there. Which systems are fragile? Which leaders are honest? Which communities take care of one another? And which turn away? They don't just test our bodies, they test our stories, the stories we tell about who we are and how much we owe each other. You've been watching Shadow Chapters. If you'd like more nights like this, more stories whispered from the fragile border between life and death, power and collapse, subscribe, leave a comment and a like, and share this video with someone who thinks history is just dates and names. Because the past is never just what we remember, it's also what we survived. And in the end, so much of our story has been written by what we never even saw coming.